Sleepovers are supposed to be fun, but mine turned into the most terrifying night of my life. I still get chills thinking about that sleepover at Mikey's house when we were in 7th grade. It was supposed to be just another Friday night with video games and junk food. The three of us huddled in Mikey's living room, with sleeping bags scattered across the floor and empty pizza boxes piled on the coffee table. Mikey's parents were out of town for the weekend, which made us feel grown up and excited to have the house to ourselves, with his older brother supposedly checking in on us, except his brother had snuck out to a party, leaving just me, Mikey, and Jake alone in the 2-story house at the end of Oakwood Drive. We had been playing video games for hours, the kind where you hunt zombies and monsters, laughing about how none of that scary stuff could happen in real life, completely unaware that our own horror story was about to begin that very night. The clock had just struck midnight when we heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the front door that made us all freeze, controllers still in hand, as we exchanged nervous glances in the blue glow of the television screen. None of us were expecting anyone, especially not at this hour, and when Mikey whispered, "What if it is my brother who forgot his keys?" I knew from the tremor in his voice that he was just as scared as Jake and I were, but we had to check, so we crept toward the front door together, peering through the peephole to see 2 men in what looked like utility uniforms standing on the porch. They looked normal enough, I guess. One tall and skinny with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, the other shorter with a bushy mustache, both wearing dark blue jumpsuits with some kind of city logo that was hard to make out in the dim porch light. "Hey kids, there has been reports of low water pressure in the neighborhood. We need to check your pipes," the taller one called through the door, his voice friendly, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Mikey, whose parents had always taught him never to open the door to strangers when home alone, called back that his parents weren't home and they would have to come back tomorrow. The men seemed annoyed, exchanging glances before the shorter one leaned closer to the door, saying, "It will only take a minute. We have to check everyone on the block tonight. It is an emergency situation." We huddled together, whispering about what to do, but ultimately decided to tell them no. We couldn't let them in without permission from Mikey's parents, and after a few more attempts to convince us, they finally left, climbing into an unmarked white van parked across the street. We double-checked all the locks, trying to laugh it off as we went back to our game, but none of us could shake the feeling that something wasn't right about those men or their story, especially when Jake pointed out that they hadn't shown any ID badges like real city workers would. Despite our unease, teenage boys will be teenage boys, and after a while, we got back into our rhythm of gaming and joking around, staying up until nearly 3 in the morning before finally crashing in our sleeping bags, the incident with the strange men becoming just another weird story to tell at school on Monday. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke to a soft scraping sound coming from somewhere in the house, my eyes flying open in the darkness, heart instantly pounding as I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, or maybe Mikey's cat moving around. But then I heard it again, more distinct this time, like metal against metal, followed by the unmistakable sound of the back door quietly opening and closing, and footsteps, slow and careful, making their way through the kitchen. I reached out and shook Mikey and Jake awake, pressing my finger to my lips when they started to stir, watching as realization and fear dawned on their faces when they too heard the footsteps now moving through the dining room, getting closer to the living room where we lay frozen in our sleeping bags. "There's someone in the house," I mouthed silently, grabbing my phone from beside my pillow as Jake pointed urgently toward the front door, our only escape route that wouldn't take us past whoever was now in the house. We moved as quietly as we could, abandoning our sleeping bags and creeping toward the front door, Mikey in the lead with the house key clutched in his trembling hand, when suddenly the living room light flicked on, momentarily blinding us as we turned to see the same 2 men from earlier standing there, the taller one holding a crowbar, the shorter one with a backpack open and filled with what looked like jewelry and electronics. "Well, what do we have here?" the tall one said, his friendly tone from earlier completely gone, replaced by something cold and dangerous as he took a step toward us. "You boys should be in bed, not witnessing things you shouldn't see." In that moment, survival instinct took over, and Mikey fumbled with the front door lock as Jake and I positioned ourselves between him and the intruders, grabbing whatever was nearby, a game controller, a television remote, anything that might buy us a few seconds. The men laughed at our pathetic attempts at defense, the shorter one starting to say something about making sure we couldn't tell anyone what we saw, when Mikey finally got the door open and we burst outside, screaming at the top of our lungs as we ran down the driveway and into the street. By some miracle, a police car was driving through the neighborhood on a routine patrol and spotted 3 kids running in terror down the middle of the road at 3 in the morning. The officer, a woman named Rodriguez who would later become my personal hero, immediately stopped and got out as we frantically told her about the men in the house. And within minutes, backup arrived and the 2 men were caught still inside Mikey's house, attempting to flee with their stolen goods. They turned out to be part of a burglary ring that had been targeting homes where they knew the owners were away, posing as utility workers to scout locations and gain entry when possible. Officer Rodriguez told us we had done everything right, from refusing to let them in earlier to escaping and getting help, rather than trying to confront them. I still think about that night whenever I hear a knock at the door after dark, or when my own kids ask to have friends sleep over. I always tell them the same thing: keep the doors locked, don't let strangers in no matter what story they tell you, and always trust that feeling when something seems off. Because sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones in video games, they're the ones pretending to be normal people with a perfectly reasonable explanation for why you should open your door and let them into your home. Sleepover horror stories are usually just made-up tales to scare your friends, but what I experienced that night at my cousin's house still haunts me to this day. I was only 9 years old when it happened, staying over at my cousin Jake's house for the weekend, while our parents went on a trip together. It was supposed to be fun, just 2 kids staying up late playing video games and eating junk food, but everything changed when the digital clock on Jake's nightstand flipped to 3 a.m. We had finally fallen asleep after hours of talking about school and trading Pokemon cards, when a strange scratching sound outside the window jolted me awake. At first, I thought it might be tree branches scraping against the glass, but there weren't any trees close enough to the house. Jake was fast asleep, his gentle snoring filling the otherwise silent room as I lay frozen in my sleeping bag on the floor. The scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone, or something, wanted to be let in. I tried to ignore it, pulling my blanket over my head and counting to 10, hoping the sound would stop. But it only grew more insistent. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, curiosity finally overcame my fear, and I slowly peeled back the covers and tiptoed to the window, careful not to wake Jake. The backyard was bathed in pale moonlight, casting long shadows across the lawn and making everything look strange and unfamiliar. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the swing set, the garden shed, and the tall wooden fence surrounding the property. But then something moved near the old oak tree at the far end of the yard, a tall, unnaturally thin figure that seemed to glide rather than walk. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things, but when I looked again, it was still there, and now I could make out more details. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, with limbs that were too long and too thin to be human, and its head was oddly shaped, almost rectangular. But what made my blood run cold were its eyes, 2 glowing red orbs that seemed to emit their own light in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to wake Jake up and call for his parents, but my voice was stuck in my throat as the figure slowly turned its head toward the window, as if it knew I was watching. For a brief, terrifying moment, those red eyes locked with mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The creature, whatever it was, tilted its head to one side in a curious gesture that was somehow more frightening than any aggressive movement would have been. Then, without warning, it took a step toward the house, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I finally managed to tear myself away from the window, diving back into my sleeping bag and pulling it tight around me as if it could offer any protection from the thing outside. I wanted to wake Jake, but a strange, paralyzing fear kept me silent. What if the thing heard me? What if calling attention to ourselves made it worse? So I lay there, heart pounding in my chest, listening intently for any sound that might indicate the creature was getting closer. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard a new sound, a soft tapping on the window, gentle but persistent. Tap, 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 like someone politely asking to be invited in. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering every prayer I could remember, begging for morning to come quickly. The tapping continued for a while, then stopped abruptly, replaced by silence that was somehow even more terrifying. The silence stretched on, broken only by Jake's soft snoring and my own ragged breathing. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with nightmares of glowing red eyes and thin, grasping fingers. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and Jake was already up, playing with his action figures on the carpet. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, convinced that what I had seen was just a nightmare, a product of too many scary stories and too much sugar before bed. But when I went downstairs for breakfast, I overheard Jake's parents talking in hushed, worried tones about strange footprints they had found in the flower bed beneath the window, deep impressions that were too large and oddly shaped to belong to any human. My aunt was suggesting it might have been a deer or some other animal, but my uncle seemed less convinced, mentioning that several neighbors had reported seeing strange figures in their yards at night over the past few weeks. I nearly dropped my cereal bowl when I heard this, the memories of what I had seen coming back with terrifying clarity. I wanted to tell them, to explain what I had witnessed, but something held me back, a childish fear that speaking about the creature might somehow summon it again. Years have passed since that night, and I've mostly convinced myself that what I saw was just my imagination running wild, a shadow distorted by moonlight and the fears of a child alone in the dark. But sometimes, when I'm staying in an unfamiliar place and find myself awake at 3 a.m., I can't help but remember those glowing red eyes and that curious tilt of the head. And I always make sure the curtains are closed tight, because deep down, a part of me is still afraid that if I look outside at that exact hour, I might see that tall, slender figure again, only this time, it might not just watch from a distance. Perhaps the strangest part of all is that Jake called me last week, his voice shaking as he told me his own son, now 9 years old himself, had come to him in the middle of the night, describing a tall creature with glowing eyes that he had seen standing in their backyard, tapping gently on his bedroom window at exactly 3 a.m. Whatever visited us that night at the sleepover so many years ago, it seems it's still out there, still watching, still waiting for someone to invite it in. Have you ever received a text message that made your blood run cold? I used to think those stories were just made up for internet points, until it happened to me last summer during what was supposed to be a normal sleepover with my 3 best friends. We had planned everything perfectly. My parents were home but promised to stay out of our way. We had enough snacks to last us through an apocalypse, and a lineup of scary movies that would keep us awake until dawn. Looking back now, I wish we had just fallen asleep during the first movie instead of what actually happened. It started out like any other sleepover, with us gossiping about school drama and taking silly photos together, posting them on our social media accounts with those cheesy captions about best friends forever. Around midnight, after our second horror movie, we decided to play Truth or Dare, which eventually turned into us sharing our deepest fears and creepiest experiences, the kind of conversations that only happen in the darkness when you are surrounded by people you trust. I remember how Mia was in the middle of telling us about the shadow figure she sometimes sees in her bedroom doorway, when my phone, which was plugged in across the room, lit up with a notification sound that made us all jump. We laughed it off as just being on edge from Mia's story, and I ignored it at first, figuring it was probably just some random app notification or a late-night text from my mom who was asleep upstairs. But when a second notification came through a minute later, followed quickly by a third and fourth, curiosity got the better of me and I walked across the room to check. The screen showed 4 new messages, all from a number that looked strangely familiar, and when I picked up my phone to unlock it, I realized with a sickening feeling that the messages were coming from my own phone number. I stood there frozen, unable to process what I was seeing, as my friends continued chattering behind me, unaware that anything was wrong. With shaking hands, I opened the messages, and what I saw made my stomach drop so violently I thought I might be sick. The first message simply read, "You all look so peaceful when you sleep," which was disturbing enough on its own, but it was the 3 photos that followed that turned my blood to ice in my veins. They showed all 4 of us from less than an hour ago, clearly asleep during the movie we had just watched, taken from different angles around my living room, including one from directly behind the couch where we had been sitting. I must have made some kind of sound because suddenly my friends were all around me, asking what was wrong, and when I showed them the messages, the room erupted into panicked theories about hacked phones and elaborate pranks. But deep down, we all knew it was neither of those things because in each photo, my phone was clearly visible, charging in the exact same spot where I had just retrieved it from. There was only one explanation. Someone had been in the house with us, watching us sleep, using some other device to send messages to my number, and they might still be here. We decided to wake my parents, huddling together as we climbed the stairs, jumping at every creak and shadow, our previous bravery during the horror movies now seeming laughably naive. My father, a naturally skeptical man who always found logical explanations for everything, took one look at the messages and immediately went into protection mode, grabbing the baseball bat he kept by their bedroom door and leading us back downstairs to search the house while my mother called the police. The next few minutes were a blur of fear and adrenaline as we followed my father from room to room, turning on every light, checking every closet and hiding spot, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then we found it, the muddy footprints leading from the living room window, which had been unlocked despite my parents' insistence that they had checked all the doors and windows before going to bed, across our hardwood floors, and then back to the window again. The police arrived within minutes, taking statements and photographs, dusting for fingerprints, and explaining that this kind of thing, while rare, was not unheard of. A stalker who had possibly been watching our social media, where we had foolishly announced our sleepover plans earlier that day. They promised to increase patrols in our neighborhood and suggested we stay somewhere else for a few days. But the damage was already done, our sense of safety shattered by the knowledge that someone had been standing over us, watching us sleep, taking photos just feet away from where we lay vulnerable and unaware. That was 6 months ago, and I still check my window locks obsessively every night before bed, still sleep with my phone under my pillow instead of charging across the room, still feel that crawling sensation on the back of my neck sometimes like I am being watched. The police never caught whoever it was, despite finding partial fingerprints that didn't match anyone in our family or friend group, and we never received any more messages from my number that night. But sometimes, when I am alone in my room at night, my phone will light up with a notification, and for a heart-stopping moment before I check it, I am back in that living room, realizing that someone had been watching us sleep, someone who had been close enough to touch us if they wanted to, someone who might have done far worse than just take photos and leave if we had not woken up when we did. If you are watching this video in your bedroom right now, I suggest you double-check your window locks before going to sleep tonight, because you never know who might be looking in, waiting for your eyes to close, waiting for their chance to come inside. And if you do somehow wake up to messages from your own phone number, whatever you do not look at the photos alone. If my story sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more terrifying true encounters just like this one. Leave a comment sharing your own unexplainable experiences, and remember to keep your windows locked tonight. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep after this.